Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, Demystifying U.S. IRB Requirements for Non-U.S. Research Professionals. I'm Lisa Szynski, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I just want to cover a couple housekeeping items. You can access the presentation slides via the resources window. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them using the Q&A window on your screen. This webinar may be eligible for continuing education credits. Qualified CE credits will be listed on your certificate of attendance. To receive a certificate of attendance, you will need to view the entire webinar and then complete a short survey at the end of the presentation. Once you have submitted your survey responses, the attendance certificate will be emailed to you within 1 business day. Sponsor sites and CROs rely on Advarra to ensure safety, quality, and efficiency throughout the clinical trial lifecycle. Our unmatched research review services, expertise, and innovative site and sponsor technology are trusted by industry leaders, including the top 50 global biopharma sponsors, the top 15 CROs, and over 3,500 institutions, hospitals, health systems, and academic medical centers, and 50,000 site investigators worldwide. Our unique portfolio of technology and services powers clinical research to make it safer, smarter, and faster. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenters. We have Denise Bedoya. She is the Director of Clinical Operations at Noema Pharma. Lindsay Lickers, who is the Senior Clinical Trial Associate at Noema Pharma. And last but not least, we have James Riddle, who is the Senior Vice President of Global Review Services Operations at Advarra. And now I'm going to be passing it over to Jeanette Morgan, who is the Global Strategic Accounts, Senior Vice President of Global Strategic Accounts. Over to you, Jeanette.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Echoing Lisa's comments, thank you so much for taking the time to join our webinar today. We realize that your time really is invaluable. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Jeanette Morgan. I am part of the Advarra team. I'm based in Ireland. For those of you who don't know, we have quite a large presence in Ireland. We've got about over 300 staff members here between Ireland and the UK. So we work with a lot of, pharmaceuticals, biotechs, and CROs that are either European headquartered or have study teams in Europe. So we support a lot of them with review services, including IRB reviews, DMC, EAC, and then technology solutions as well for study startup. The reason that we put together today's webinar is really a lot of people based in Europe, they don't really understand the US IRB submission process, or they find it very, very complicated. So we're really here to kind of demystify that and help you out with it. We've had several requests over the past few months to provide more information on the North American submission process, and therefore thought that it would be a really good idea to get all of you together to have this webinar today with some of our subject matter experts and Noema, who have kindly decided to be part of this as well, and who are going to speak to this. So I'm going to go through the agenda really quickly because I know everybody's eager to hear from our subject matter experts. In part one of the webinar, James Riddle, who's one of our own, will provide an overview of the US FDA and Health Canada requirements for ethics review and discuss some of the fundamentals. In part two, we're going to have Denise and Lindsay from Noema Pharma, which is a Swiss-based biotech company. They're going to share their experience submitting for ethics review in the US versus submitting in Europe, their experience kind of managing the process themselves versus working with a CRO. We're very used to that. And then some best practices and tips for your next submission. And then we're going to move on to part three, where I'll moderate a panel discussion with James, Lindsay, and Denise. And there will be some time for audience Q&A as well. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the event, and we'll get to as many as possible during the Q&A session. And please don't be shy. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to James Riddle, who's basically going to start the presentation. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Jeanette. Appreciate the very kind introduction. For those of you who are watching on the stream, I am the little black icon with the audio symbol on it this morning. I had some difficulty with technology being what it is. Sometimes it would be nice to go back to good old quill and papyrus, but alas, you get audio version of me. And if you want to see what I look like, I'm sure my picture's out there somewhere. For my part of the webinar, I would like to just take a few moments to level set for our colleagues over in the EU or parts elsewhere on how the general framework for IRB or ethics committee review works here in the North American segment. As Jeanette mentioned, we get a number of questions at Advarra regarding how this really works. How can the 50 United States be able to have a single IRB submission that would cover all sites within the 50 United States? And it can be a little intimidating if you are not here and in it day to day, much like sometimes our United States-based colleagues feel about the EU environment and navigating that environment. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes before we hear from our colleagues at Noema is provide a bit of level setting on how this process for a centralized IRB works here in North America. So first and foremost, the IRB system in the United States and in Canada as well is based on a set of fundamental ethical principles that are likely familiar to our colleagues in the EU and elsewhere, but to some extent are uniquely based in the United States. And the ethical principles are here on the screen. We are not going to have time to get into these in any length, but there are a number of additional webinars that Advarra has put on over the past few years that can dive into each one of these if you're interested. The core principles: have respect for persons, ask them for informed consent. Make sure that the research has a positive risk-benefit ratio and that the research does not unnecessarily include or exclude a certain group of individuals unless there's a scientific basis to do so. And those ethical principles have been around here in the United States since the 1970s, and the IRB system here in the U.S. still follows these basic ethical principles when applying the U.S. federal regulations, and the folks at Health Canada and the research ethics boards that are operated in Canada follow the same basic ethical principles. And these shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. The regulatory framework here in the United States, if you don't take anything else away from the webinar, just know that we have a two-part regulatory framework in the U.S. One set of regulations that governs how IRBs work comes from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. If you are a regulatory wonk like myself, you can go and Google the Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 50 and 56, and read all about how the U.S. Food and Drug Administration requires experiments involving drugs, devices, biologics, etc., things that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration oversees. That if you are going to do a clinical investigation involving humans, you have to have IRB approval before you can experiment on humans. That's pretty straightforward and in keeping with and very similar to EU EMA regulations requiring ethics committees and the like. In the United States, we also have a separate set and an additional set of regulations that are governed by the U.S. Health and Human Services Division, Office of Human Research Protection. These regulations at 45 Code of Federal Regulations 46, and I promise I'm not going to go through and quote a whole bunch more regulations here, but this is important. These regulations govern federally funded human research and include more types of research than the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration has authority to regulate clinical investigations involving drugs, devices, and biologics. But that excludes social behavioral research, surgery research, research that doesn't involve a U.S. Food and Drug Administration regulated product. Those types of research, to the extent that they are funded by the U.S. federal government, are additionally subject to the Office of Human Research Protection. So in brief, there's two sets of regs. They overlap in the middle, but there are some research projects here in the United States that are governed by one set, not the other. And to the extent that you're coming into the U.S., it's important to understand that there are two. And here's why. Most drug and device companies that are doing research here in the United States will be governed by U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Depending on the research location where you are placing your research, you may also be subject to the common rule regulations if that research institution applies them to all research, regardless of the funding source. And that's important because if you are trying to work with an institution here in the United States and they keep talking about the common rule, this is why they're talking about the common rule. The common rule is the euphemism for the Office of Human Research Protection. So take-home message, two sets of regulations, they do overlap. It's important to understand how both work. Now, here in the United States, another important distinction, and this is applicable to Canada as well, is that we have allowed in our country for private businesses to administer the ethics committee that oversees the research. Now, we also have institutions that conduct research, so think Duke, Harvard, Yale, et cetera, that also have and administer their own ethics committee for research happening at their institution. But here in the United States, we allow for private businesses to administer the ethics committee. The ethics committee is still independent of the company that's administering them, but it is a very unique United States construct to be able to have private business be able to administer the ethics committee. And why is that important? Mainly because as you go through the submission process for doing ethics committee review, as many of you know in the EU, there's multiple ethics committees you have to navigate. Some of them are government run, some of them are charged by the government to be able to do the ethics committee review, but there's multiple ethics committees that the sponsor needs to interact with. Here in the United States, the private companies that administer the ethics committees work with each institution to provide the ethics committee oversight. So the sponsor ends up with having to only make one submission to the central IRB, and then that central IRB can cover all of the performance sites in the United States, and some of us can also do Canada as well. So it's a different paradigm for the sponsor. And we think, as a society, that it is a little bit more efficient to do it that way. The individual states inside the United States do have specific requirements, and some of them have their own uniquenesses relative to research. The larger commercially administered IRBs keep track of each of the individual 50 state requirements and apply those standards as applicable as we were reviewing. So for instance, when Advarra reviews research in a particular state where the age of majority, when you can consent to your own research procedures, we will keep track of where those states are different. Most states are 18 in the United States. Some states are 19. It varies as you move around the country. And there are uniquenesses like that. The uniquenesses are probably not as striking as you would find in the EU member states. In fact, I'm sure they are not. The types of differences that you find from state to state do reflect local governance as well as local research priorities. And we do in the United States as well as Canada also have individual Native American tribal regulations that if you are going to be conducting research on U.S. Native American tribal lands, they likely will have a separate oversight process that occurs. Now, what do you need to do in order to get IRB review here in the United States? Is first and foremost, you need a central IRB partner. There are many of us out there that provide commercially administered IRB review. that covers the entire country. There are two primary providers, IRB, when it comes to IRB, Advarra is the largest. The IRB application is one central application to the central IRB that can come from the sponsor, covers the protocol and the science, drug brochure, protocol, template, consent. The IRB will review the science, ask any questions of the sponsor directly, and then each site that is going to be conducting that research has to submit their own short IRB application to be able to have the IRB vet that site to determine if they're qualified to actually conduct the study. From the sponsor's perspective, it is one application to the central IRB, and that central application covers all of the U.S. domestic performance sites as well as Canada if your IRB partner is covering provinces in Canada. Timeline here in the U.S., just to compare this with your EU experience, in general, give or take, 5 to 10 business days for the protocol review, 3 to 5 business days for the site review. And let's talk just a little bit about Canada. The Canadian provinces each have their own research regulations relative to commercially administered ethics committees. You do, as a commercially administered research ethics board, have to meet certain requirements. And even if you do, some of the provinces do not allow for a commercially administered research ethics board, Alberta and Newfoundland being the two primary places where central IRB services are not permitted. Some of the provinces have some limitations on experimentation involving minors being prohibited, namely in Quebec. But otherwise, for most of the major metropolitan areas in Canada, the central IRB that you choose for the U.S. market can also be the central research ethics board that you choose for Canada. There are several of us that cover both locations. Now, last, I'd like to just talk about the U.S. FDA Single IRB Mandate. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that some academic institutions administer their own internal IRB that the institution will require you to use in certain cases. That particular requirement or that particular construct of the institution doing their own local IRB review is going to be coming to an end soon. The U.S. FDA is mandating that all U.S. domestic performance sites that will be conducting a FDA-regulated clinical investigation, target device trials, will use the single IRB selected by the sponsor. We were anticipating that rule would be coming in May with the change in the administration in Washington, D.C. It's been delayed. It's now slated to be in place in 2026. But it will facilitate more sites utilizing the single IRB. So stay tuned for more about FDA SIRB mandates coming. I'd like to, that's the basic framework. Just to sum up, single IRB submission to a central IRB in the United States can cover all locations. And the IRB that you submit to, the primary difference here in the United States is that the IRB can be administered by a commercial entity like Advarra. So Advarra as a business, one of our service lines is administration of the IRB system. So it's a big difference from how you operate in the EU. We think it's more efficient. Key part is to choose a good partner. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our colleagues at Noema to talk a little bit about their experience. Both of the representatives from Noema have a good deal of history in navigating this fairly complex space. And I'm going to hand it over to them now.
Great. Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. And I, for one, am very excited about that mandate. And sites should be too, especially academic. So thank you all for attending today and listening to our presentation. I will only take a few minutes to talk about Noema because that's not why we're here today. As mentioned earlier, Noema is a Swiss company. However, we have a pretty large contingent in Boston. I clearly am not Swiss. I am located in Texas, so I am one of our U.S. folks, as Lindsay is as well, located in New York. We are a relatively small company. Have been around for about 4 years, continuing to grow, we hope. And I just quickly put up our pipeline. We've got a lot of exciting things in the works. Some of these studies are coming to the closure of enrollment and hopefully readout sometime in this year. Some of the other ones are just starting, and our stuttering program has completed. So personally, I am part of the trigeminal neuralgia study and the VMS study. And so both are very exciting and very near and dear to my heart. If you'd like more information about Noema, our pipeline, and who we are, obviously, you can go to noemapharma.com. I also just wanted to quickly note about myself a little bit. I have experienced IRBs from all aspects. I was on site for many, many years, academic site. So had the fight of, can we use a central IRB versus our very long-winded local IRB. I was also at a CRO for many years, so had that experience as well. And now I'm at a sponsor. So very excited to share my experiences. And I will, without further ado, turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay.
Sure. Thank you, Denise. So my name's Lindsay. I'm the Senior Clinical Trial Associate at Noema. I work with Denise on our VMS program, and I also work on our Tourette's program. And I am going to get into some of our company's experience with the U.S. IRB process and some of the experience that Denise and I have had personally. As she said, our company is based in Basel, Switzerland, but we do have a cohort of U.S.-based employees based around our office in Boston, but of course, some of us are a little further away. So far, the experience that I've heard from our Swiss colleagues, however, with U.S. IRB submissions has been mostly the same as what Denise and I have experienced. In talking with them, it seems like there really is not a ton of difference based on where you're submitting from. The website that we've used really looks the same for us and our Swiss colleagues. So I personally work across those two different programs right now, and both of them have activity in the U.S. One is a smaller study with a handful of sites that is being conducted in the U.S. only. For this trial, we have managed most of the IRB process internally. The other study I work on that is active in the U.S. is a proportionally larger study that also includes countries around the globe, including the European Union. For this study, we have utilized our CRO partner to help us manage the U.S. IRB submissions. We made that decision because of our company's smaller size. It helps us to not be bogged down in the day-to-day when there are a large number of sites to kind of manage and oversee submissions for. So for us, that decision to manage the IRB submissions in-house versus outsourcing to a CRO mainly is due to available time and resources, not necessarily the complexity. But it does help to have additional resources when there are questions. It also helps to maintain consistency on our larger studies, since the CRO can help us handle regulatory submissions in other countries. So this, of course, is up to your company and their contract with CRO and your decision based on what resources you have available. Listed on the slide above are some of the other countries our company has conducted clinical trials in. So we have experience with a lot of different companies, not just EU and US. Some of these have much more tedious submission processes with longer timelines compared to US. So the decision of how to manage the submissions ultimately comes down to the structure of your individual company and what works best for you, given your available time and resources. But for us, it has been very manageable on our smaller US-only study to do it all in-house. The process has been very straightforward, and I'll walk through some of the steps in just a moment. It also moves very quickly. As James mentioned, I think the timeline for review is about 5 to 10 business days, and I have definitely observed that to be true, and it has been very convenient and allowed for us to implement changes that take effect very quickly. So when I make a submission, I get a notification directly to my email once it's approved. And if there's questions that I need to address, I also get that notification so we can get in there and make changes very quickly. We see notifications when sites make submissions, so we can keep an eye on what's going on at their level as well. For studies where the IRB submissions are outsourced, it is of course easier since you have additional resources to manage that work. But of course, you have to pay for that service. Additionally, though, those folks will often be specialized regulatory staff in their respective countries and have thorough knowledge and experience of the process, so they can usually help as well. CROs still require sponsor oversight, however, and I do think that oversight of our CRO partner is easier to understand when you have managed the submissions previously yourself. So it's nice to have that experience of doing it yourself so that you understand what the process is when you're outsourcing it. Having the experience from handling the smaller study myself, I have appropriate expectations on the timelines, and I know how to address the issues that might need sponsor input. So for both of the studies that I work on, I still receive notifications directly from the IRB portal. So even on my study where it's outsourced, I can kind of keep track of what's going on. Sometimes the CRO will be the only source of updates, so you don't have to be bothered with it. But that, of course, is a decision that you can make with your CRO, depending on your company's situation. So getting into kind of the steps for doing it in-house for our smaller study where we're managing the IRB submissions in-house, the process to get started was very straightforward. Our company had worked with Advarra before, I think in some of the very early days that we were working, but we hadn't worked with them recently, and it was some different staff members. So when Denise and I were getting one of our studies kicked off, we wanted to get a better idea of the process and how it would work. So we reached out to the IRB just on the website via the contact page. It was super simple. Someone reached back out and we were able to set up a meeting. At that meeting, we talked about kind of what our needs were for our upcoming study, and they walked us through their capabilities, walked us through their website, and gave us instructions for submitting, even though the submission process seemed very simple. So we were able to walk away from that meeting feeling very confident that we could handle it ourselves. They were also able to provide pricing quotes, so we would have a better idea of the cost and the timeline. So after that, we made accounts on the Central IRB website, got access to the submission portal. We were able to submit the protocol as soon as it was approved internally. It was all very a quick process. For us, this included the FDA submission had already been completed, which is something to keep in mind, but is a separate process from the Central IRB submission. Once you're in the portal, you can just click the button for submit a new protocol, and it walks you through all of the required information. So as long as you have everything and your documents are ready to go, you can make the submission in one sitting. I was able to also add other team members into the portal, so they would have access to the protocol submission if they needed to go in and make any changes in my absence, or just if they had more availability to help. After the submission was completed, we got a confirmation email and we were assigned an IRB coordinator who we could contact with any questions. I have had to reach out to ours a few times and they've always been very helpful and they get back to us pretty quickly. So overall, it's felt like a very simple process to submit our protocol at the sponsor kind of protocol level. And I was surprised really at how straightforward it was. I just assumed when we started, I was like, this has got to be complicated. And it really wasn't, which was very exciting. So we've been able to manage that mostly ourselves. The site level submissions would then be the next step, and that is a similarly straightforward process for the sites. And most of the sites you work with in the U.S. that are allowed to use Central IRB will have experience with doing these submissions, and they'll be familiar with most of the major IRBs. So getting into some more about the accelerated timelines, one of the big differences between the US and other countries is just how quickly that you can move things along. The US moves very quickly compared to most other countries. Of course, in the US, protocols and amendments also need to be submitted to the FDA. Timelines for that can vary, so that's something else to keep in mind. For the IRB, however, 10 business days is typical, which is much faster to get a protocol approved than most countries. Our team usually allots up to 90 days for submissions in Europe to complete, sometimes even more than that, depends on the size of the type of submission. So that's a huge difference. In my experience, the IRB team moves quickly to get your protocol assigned to a meeting, but then if you do have a submission in place and you need to edit it, I've had good luck with contacting our IRB coordinator, and they've been able to pause those submissions if it does need to be edited later and you need more time, as long as your review process hasn't started yet. In that way, it's a super flexible process, and so you can make the submission centrally prior to any site selection occurring, which is great since your sites are going to be submitting later. You can really submit a protocol if it's ready, even if your sites aren't up and running, or even if your site selection isn't completed yet. This is a lot different from Europe, where your sites have to be submitted as a piece of your overall submission. So you kind of have to have your site lists ready to go. I have had situations in other countries where a new site is added and then it takes months to get that site approved. And this has definitely not happened to us in the US. A new site can be reviewed and approved in as little as 5 business days. In my experience, for central IRB sites, the IRB approval is rarely the rate limiting step. Usually the rate limiting step is something like rater training or getting lab kits shipped in. But of course, that'll vary by study and indication. So local IRB sites, of course, take longer, but like James said, with the new mandate, hopefully that will be going away soon, which is very exciting for us. But there are pros and cons of those sites. So we usually consider the IRB type when we're doing our site selection. So getting into some more differences, you might experience with the US versus the EU. I'm using the EU as a primary example, but of course your results may vary in other countries as well. I would say I don't think any of them are as fast as the US. But one of the big differences between US and EU is differences in data privacy laws. In the EU, there's been a lot more prep work that we have to do on our end, especially on ICFs, to ensure that we're complying with each country's data privacy laws. And those are, of course, different across the different countries in the European Union. Some of the countries will also have specific templates that you need to use for ICFs. And so overall, it's a bit more work up front to get those ICFs ready. And typically, with us being a small company, that's something we'll need to collaborate with the CRO on, which costs more money and takes a little bit more time. The US data privacy laws are much less strict than the EU. Even so, the central IRB will usually check that all the appropriate language is added, like James was saying. So even if you're missing critical language to comply with data privacy laws or HIPAA laws, typically the IRB will add it in for you. I know we have utilized that a few times. You can send your ICF in and they'll make sure that your HIPAA language is appropriate, and they'll even add it in if you're missing it. So, and then when sites make their submissions, the central IRB will also adjust for individual state requirements as well. So you don't have to really work too hard to keep them all straight, though it's usually helpful to have your sites check their final consent forms too, since they should be familiar with their own state's requirements. And then I spoke a little bit previously on site selection, but under US central IRBs, you can submit sites as soon as they're ready and get them up and running really quickly. In the EU previously, as I said, you have to submit those sites centrally. So it does take a much longer time, especially if your site selection is kind of an ongoing process. Of course, there are those local IRB sites, but some institutions have been improving their local IRB timelines more as well. And then, of course, those local IRB sites are going to be more of your academic institutions where you might find your important KOLs. So for us, it's been helpful to have mixes of both depending on the study that you're doing, but it's been helpful to be able to target our site selection based on the timelines and overall study need. So the study that I spoke about earlier, where we have a small study going on in the US only, we were able to get that up and running really quickly, which was one of the factors that contributed to us selecting the US as the main country for that study. Similar to initial submission process, the submission of amendments is also much faster in the U.S. I won't speak to the FDA submission requirements as that can vary, but IRB timelines for amendments and ad hoc submissions like new patient-facing material or new advertisement material is still also about 10 business days, and it's just as simple as the initial submission, if not more so. There's a button in the portal for modifications, and you can even select which sites it applies to, so it can be approved at the site level even quicker, depending on if it needs site-specific edits or not. This allows for a lot of flexibility compared to other countries where just submitting those patient-facing materials or advertisement materials can still take up to 90 days. Additionally, in a lot of countries, you can't have multiple submissions in at once, so you have to submit one, wait for it to be approved, and then you can't submit an amendment this week and then new patient-facing materials next week. You would have to wait for one of those to be approved. But in the US, we can just kind of send in multiple submissions if there's a need for that, which is very convenient. So just getting into some last tips and advice for if you do want to handle a clinical trial IRB submissions in-house, or if you're just starting to work in the US and this is new to you. I would say it's been very helpful to have that initial conversation with your IRB of choice. That really helped us feel more confident in the process and gave us someone to ask specific questions to before we got started. Hopefully standard practice for most or all of you, but make sure you're tracking your changes very closely on amendments or any study material that is changed. The submissions for modifications will usually require track changes versions of protocols and other items. For ICFs specifically, we typically only have to submit the track changes version. It's usually in a Word format, and then when the final approved consent form comes out from the IRB, it'll be a PDF with any missing language included. It's good to have a good understanding of your expected timelines, so the IRB representative can help you understand this a little bit closer, but it's good to know what your expectations are internally as well. If you're running your studies in multiple countries, you know now that you can get the US up and running typically a lot faster than other countries, so it's something to keep in mind if you're trying to get your study up and running kind of all at once. Plan ahead for your amendments, especially if you want consistency across global sites. Consider the timelines of your other countries and your local IRB sites because they're all going to be different. So if you're using only central IRB US sites, then you'll know that your timeline is going to be really quick, but it's helpful to keep track of all of them individually. Some other pieces that I thought of more recently that might be helpful when you do submit your protocol submission form initially, it's helpful to take a look through that form ahead of time so you can be prepared with all of the information that you need. So when you do get access to a portal for submissions, just click through that submission form so you can see that you have everything. That's super helpful just to be prepared. And then I would also add to make sure you're considering your FDA submissions as well, since this is not a consolidated process with the IRB ethics review like it is in some countries. So it could be helpful to consult a regulatory resource where you work or review your SOPs to determine how to manage this in your individual companies. So that's just a little bit about our experience. I'm going to pass it back to Jeanette to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was super, super informative. I think every time I join these, I learn something new as well, and I work at Advarra. So I'm just going to encourage everybody. There's a Q&A field. I think it's at the right-hand corner of your screen. I think we all have different screens based on how we dial in. But please be encouraged to put any questions in there. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. And again, if we don't get to them, we will definitely answer them offline. And like Lindsay mentioned, I think I would encourage everybody, if you want to have a one-on-one session with the Advarra team on this as well, we are more than happy to do so. So we've prepared some questions. These are kind of like the most frequently asked questions, hence why we put these together. So I'm going to ask, I think, 3-4 questions, and then we're going to go to the Q&A field as well. So first question, what are examples of a straightforward EU-UK submission versus a challenging EU-UK submission, and how does that compare to the US? And I'm going to ask Denise if you can answer that one, please.
Sure, of course. And I think Lindsay did a great job of almost answering this, but prepping us for the comparators across the countries. So recently, I'm just going to talk about some of the experiences I've had with a recent protocol that was global, including countries all over the world. US, we were able to get everything submitted and through a central IRB very quickly. We had one site that was academic that took a little longer, but the challenging aspect was the timing as opposed to the questions, et cetera. Now, in the EU and UK, it was a bit different, where every country had a little bit of change they wanted to add. So at one point, we had multiple versions of the protocol based on the country, which ultimately led to a global protocol. So straightforward versus challenging, I think they're all challenging in a different way, but now that CTIS is in place, I think those challenges will be slightly alleviated. One example that I can talk about is, I won't mention any country because all of the countries are great. We all, everybody has their own bumps in the road, but we had one country that we submitted everything we thought they wanted, yet they kept coming back with questions that we thought we answered, and they would just ask again in a different way. So it was a bit challenging trying to understand what they were asking and why we weren't answering it. And we ultimately requested a meeting with that particular country's EC and found that we were basically talking around each other. So my recommendation would be, if you have any country ECs or RAs that are coming back with questions, perhaps answer once. If it seems that it's not working out, then request a meeting. Not all ECs and RAs are open to meetings, and you may be meeting with a representative as opposed to somebody who's on one of the actual boards or committees, but that is still very, very helpful. That particular country ended up taking almost 9.5 months to get through. And if you have a study that is not going to last more than a year and a half, that's quite a chunk of your timing. So that, I think there's a question later about, do decisions of site selection and country selection, are they impacted by the timing of your submissions? And the answer is a strong yes. So, that's one issue. Another is that the question of, do we need to add to the protocol what country A wants if country B didn't ask for it? And the ultimate answer is yes. And maybe I'm kind of straying a little bit from the question, but it's hard to give a straightforward answer on this. I had one country where we literally checked every box that their committees wanted. It went through and got submitted and reviewed with minimal questions and approved within 3.5 months, which in my experience is incredibly fast for a non-U.S. Site. So that was a very easy submission. I've only had one of those in my entire career. Most are challenging because not only do you have specific requirements for the EC submission, but then you also have requirements for other review committees in their country, whether it's an RA or something more specific, depending on the population. You may have additional country level reviews that need to happen. So going back to what Lindsay said, take the time at the start to prep and look at all of what could possibly be requested from your country that you're going into, and ensure that you have all of that from the start. It'll be much, much easier. Also try very hard to submit a full package, including everything you think that you'll need, patient-facing materials, patient scales, whatever your protocol calls for. Because in most EU and UK submissions, you have to wait. If you forget to submit something or it's not quite ready, you have to wait until your first submission is approved. How does that compare to the U.S.? I think Lindsay went over that very well, but very long story short, the U.S., you can pretty much keep submitting. You need to really keep in mind what you're submitting so it doesn't get lost in the process or hold up what is currently being reviewed. I know that was kind of a different answer to the question, but I hope that that made sense.
No, that definitely makes sense. You're taking me back to my project management days with hundreds of sites globally and 14 different countries. It was definitely a challenging one as well. So thank you. That's great information. Let's move on to the next one. So do any individual U.S. states have odd or interesting requirements that have presented a challenge or made it difficult to work in that state? I love this question because I know you guys, you do. And I think coming from a country and having to face state challenges, it's difficult. So I'm going to ask James, I know you've handled this a lot, if you could provide some insight into this one.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. I think some folks do have a misnomer that the United States is perhaps, well, maybe not quite as much as of late, that we're just one big, happy, cohesive, regulatorily aligned family. And that, unfortunately, is just not the case in some cases. We are 50 independent states, all aligned under a common umbrella. We don't have in the 50 states as much uniquenesses in our IRB and research ethics programs as the member states do in the EU, admittedly. However, we do have some states that have some very interesting things, and I'll just rattle off half a dozen here or so. In the state of California, for instance, the HIPAA privacy disclosure language has to be in 14-point font because someone in Sacramento, California decided that that was going to be the case. And so when the IRB is approving consent forms for use in the state of California, as the central IRB, we have to make sure that the font is 14-point. We don't have to do that for any other state. There are certain states in the nation where, as I mentioned during the earlier part of the presentation, the age of being able to consent to research is 19 versus the age in most of the other states being 18. And so you have to, as a central IRB, accommodate in the consent form the differences in when, here in the United States, it's called the age of majority. And as you move around the country, that age changes. Some protocols that we see coming to the central IRB will have very specific age ranges for assenting for children, for instance. And as the central IRB, we will try and work with you to try to get to a point where the protocol is executable in all 50 states without specific age ranges and the like. But the consent form needs to be modified in order to accommodate that. And that's just a few examples. Oregon has some very specific genetic disclosure laws. Illinois has some very interesting requirements relative to compensation for injury. And then, of course, you get into each individual research institution. And the institutions themselves, the university of whatever's, may have their own local policies and procedures that need to be accommodated as part of the central IRB process. So I don't know if I would say that any particular state is more difficult than any other state, but I would say that when, particularly for folks who are working with the centralized IRB model in the United States and Canada, if you're not from that environment, just be sure that when you're selecting your central IRB partner, that they have good experience working throughout all of the different jurisdictions. And then I would just say, lastly, here in the United States, and in Canada as well, the Native American and Indigenous peoples have on their tribal lands additional requirements that you have to navigate. So if you have a specific requirement to do research in the U.S. Native American tribes, you'll need to understand how to navigate that environment as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that.
I'll just say that we are more alike than we are different, but we aren't exactly all the same when it comes to the U.S. 50 states.
Lindsay, would you tend to agree?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think James covered most of the differences that you're going to see. But luckily, from our perspective as a sponsor, despite all of those differences that you see across different states, it's been fairly easy to manage with Central IRB because they will check and make sure that you have all of the language appropriately. And then, like I said, I think in my presentation, it's good to have your sites check over everything as well because they should be familiar with their local laws.
Fantastic. So let's move on today. Yeah, so I think we covered some of this, but if there's anything to add, what are some of the challenges with managing ICF?
So
I think Lindsay.
Yeah, I can jump in. Some of the challenges with global studies is kind of keeping all of your languages straight along with your ICF templates. In the US, you're also going to see some different languages depending on the choice of locations that you've picked and the populations that are present at your site. So you still might have to manage some translations, whether that's Spanish. I've seen Haitian Creole in some areas of the US. Sometimes other languages pop up, but depending on the population of where you're managing, where your sites are and where your study is. So that's something to keep in mind so you can keep all of those straight. And then keeping site-specific ICFs aligned is fairly easy within the portal because if the sites are making changes to their own ICF, they'll just submit it. And then when that's approved, you as the sponsor will receive a copy so you can file all of those appropriately. So I think overall it's very straightforward as long as you know your requirements and you know the languages that you're working in and you're able to keep all of your versions up to date as you make changes to your protocol.
Fantastic. We get asked that question a lot, so that's great that you cover this. So let's go to the last question, which we had. How does the Central IRB framework in the US make it easier and more efficient to make modifications to the protocol? So I don't know, James, if you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I can certainly take that one on. If you think back to the slide that I had about 3D, where the sponsor was working with multiple different ethics committees in the EU space to gain approval, versus the U.S. model where the sponsor is working directly with the Central IRB to cover all U.S. and possibly Canadian performance sites. So when you have an amendment, the Central IRB process that we have here in the United States makes it much more efficient for the sponsor to be able to get approval for a modification to the research and distribute that modification out to the individual performance sites in a timely manner. That if you are unilaterally working with dozens or more of local ethics committees in the various member states, each of those are running at their own speed, you end up with, and anyone who's run a multi-regional clinical trial knows, you have to have a plan in place for dealing with how you're going to have some sites executing version 3 of the protocol while other sites have moved on to version 4. Here in the United States, we feel that creates a particular potential subject safety issue where some participants are running on older versions of the protocol. And so while it isn't the primary reason for the design here in the United States, the SIRB framework or this commercially administered IRBs that are a central point of review and distribution of changes to the research certainly make modifications to the protocol more efficient, but it also is more protective for the patients because everyone is, as near as possible, operating off of the same version of the protocol. And for my colleagues at Noema, is there anything you'd like to add in that summation?
No, I mean, I think you covered it, and I think we spoke a lot to it in our presentation, how much quicker the timelines are in the US. And you can submit things back to back if needed, if you have additional changes that pop up. So that's very convenient compared to a lot of countries.
And the communication pathway is much easier. You're speaking to one as opposed to 10 different countries.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to go to one of the questions in the Q&A section. So I know we only have, I think, four minutes left, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. So we'll try to get in one or two. So basically, do you know if the EU or the UK is planning to move to a more centralized model like in the US? So James, I think you're your best place to answer that one, I'd say.
Yeah, I would like to, first and foremost, I don't work for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but the United States is a pretty efficient place to conduct research. That's why a good portion of clinical investigations happen here in the North American space between the United States and Canada. We do an outsized amount of volunteering as a population for clinical trials. We also have the incentives and economic engines to make clinical research run as effectively and efficiently as we do. It would be interesting to see if the European Union and the various member states, considering the consolidation and centralization you've been able to accomplish under the EMA, might move to a more centralized ethics committee model. It does provide a number of benefits that we've outlined. It is not perfect by any means, but the efficiency with which we can ethically oversee the research, provide an independent review of the clinical investigation with an independent review body, and do the administrative work of distributing those approval materials and the consent forms out to the site, it is certainly enabled by the central IRB model, as well as the U.S. regulatory framework that we have, even though there are two parts to it and they do overlap, and sometimes it is confusing to figure out which set of regulations you need to follow. It is clear, at least in the United States and Canada, what you need to do in each of the regulatory regimes. So I hope that answers the question. The short answer is I'm not sure if the EU is heading in that direction or not. We would have to leave that to our EU counterparts.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So we're just on the hour. I don't want to take up any more time, but we will basically answer all of the questions that come in through the Q&A either individually, or we can send them out to everybody as well. And if you have any questions after this webinar, please get in touch also. So thank you so much for joining the webinar. I'm just going to hand it over to my colleague, Lisa, who you heard from at the very beginning, and Lisa's just going to close it out for us.
Thank you, Jeanette, and thank you to James and Lindsay and Denise for their very informative presentation. I just wanted to add that we do have this great resource called Ask Advarra, so you can get pressing research questions answered within 1 business day. So to submit a question, you can either, there should be a CTA button on the right-hand side, or you can simply visit the URL that is located on the slide here. And then finally, thank you for attending our webinar today. A friendly reminder that when the broadcast ends, a survey will appear, and you need to complete the survey to get a certificate emailed to you. Don't forget to connect with us on LinkedIn, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.